We're continuing our view of the prophecy of Daniel 2, Daniel 7, and the Fourth World Empire. The preterists do accept that some kind of transition occurred with the Roman Empire, as we read in Revelation 13, verse 3, and I saw one of his heads, as it were, wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. In verse 12, and he exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. They do accept that there is some kind of transition in the Roman Empire, but they limit this to the time of Nero. The preterist Ken Gentry writes in his book, The Beast of Revelation, James Moffat states the matter well when he writes regarding Revelation 13, verse 3. The allusion is to the terrible convulsions which in 69 AD shook the empire to its foundation. Nero's death, with the bloody interregnum after it, was a wound to the state from which it only recovered under Vespasian. It fulfilled the tradition of the wounded head. The vitality of the pagan empire, shown in this power of righting itself after the revolution, only added to its prestige. The relevant verses in Revelation regarding the death and revivification of the beast can properly be understood as prophesying the earth-shaking historical events of the late 60s era. Rome died, as it were, and returned to life again. With the death of Nero and the ensuing civil wars which plagued Rome, the world witnessed what surely was to be the final demise of mighty Rome. But to the surprise of friend and foe alike, Rome arose anew under Vespasian to assert its vitality and to demonstrate its power. So the position of the preterists seems to be that it is with Nero and his death, which by the way was by suicide, that the Roman Empire was wounded unto death. The empire was plunged into a very brief time of upheaval and total chaos. It seemed like the entire empire might crumble and fall, and then it stabilized again and was restored to life under the Roman Emperor Vespasian. Well, let's look at the historicist understanding of this. In the Revelation, why do we read in Revelation 12, verse 3, this, and there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his heads? Why does it specifically state here that the crowns are upon the 7 heads, and why are there no crowns upon the 10 horns, if indeed these 10 horns be 10 Roman emperors, as some preterists suppose? Why also, when we come to Revelation 13, verse 1, do we read this? And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns. Why do we find that the crowns have moved from the 7 heads to the 10 horns? What does all of this mean? How do the preterists explain this? To the historicist, the meaning is obvious. With the movement of the crowns from the heads to the horns, there has been a transition of power, rulership, or authority from one governmental form to another. The great red dragon with 7 heads is pagan Rome, and it transitions to the form of a dreadful beast. It carries over with it Rome, but there has been a change in its government, ruling, and authoritative structure. The authority has moved from the heads to the horns, and as horns are a biblical symbol that designates a kingdom, it shows that this authority has moved to 10 kingdoms. And out of this was to come another little horn or kingdom who was to make a jolly nuisance of himself, and that has to be the understatement of this presentation. For more of the details, the specific details, you need to look at Revelation 12 and 13 on our YouTube channel. But we will continue this discussion here in the next few slides. Looking at this image, when we consider the prophecy of Daniel and the Revelation, we must also consider the whole story, or the bigger picture. We must consider the significant historical events connected to the Fourth World Empire, the legs of iron. The fall of Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans was indeed extremely significant and has its rightful prominence in Bible prophecy. However, and thankfully, this is not the end of the prophetic light. The light is very bright and it shines into the darkness of historical development. God is on the throne, orchestrating the affairs of men, and a proper understanding of Bible prophecy will give you a profound appreciation as to the full extent of this. Bible prophecy is history foretold, and history is Bible prophecy fulfilled. We are meant to be able to line up the two, Bible prophecy and history, side by side, and this is part and parcel of having a more sure word of prophecy. History, evidence from creation, which I'm going to get to later, and the Word of God all line up together to compel the reader to a certain understanding. Considering the image of Daniel 2 now, historically the preterist position that the Rome of prophecy came to an end in the 1st century AD simply does not fit. Rome rose to the height of its power and glory and came into its golden age only after Jerusalem had fallen. It then went into a decline and eventually fell, only to re-emerge under a different form, and this is very basic history. In this picture we see that, in very broad terms, the Iron Kingdom continued as a whole entity until the close of the 4th century AD when, with a momentous earthquake, the empire was divided into the Eastern and Western Roman empires. The Eastern Roman Empire continued until the last vestiges of it were overthrown by the Turkish Ottoman Empire in 1453 AD with the fall of Constantinople. Some people are of the view that the two legs of the image represent the Western and Eastern Roman empires, but this view is incorrect. If it were true, then the two thighs of the Grecian Empire would have to indicate a similar thing, and of course they don't. Now, the situation with the Western Roman Empire was markedly different from the Eastern Roman Empire. Following the split between East and West, the Western Roman Empire was beset by a series of Gothic invasions which eventually extinguished the light of its sun and plunged the empire into darkness in 476 AD. For all intents and purposes, the Western Roman Empire had come to an end. It was dead and buried, it was wounded unto death, but the fact was that it phoenixed. From the ashes of the pagan Roman Empire, the Iron Empire continued under the 10 Gothic kingdoms that established themselves with its fall. This was the time of the beginning of the feet of iron mixed with clay. This is the time of the rise of Papal Rome and the coming forth of the Holy Roman Empire. One of the 7 heads, or forms of government, was wounded unto death, but its deadly wound was healed, and the whole world wondered after the beast. All of these things are borne out in the historical records, and all of this was prophesied in Daniel and the Revelation. In the book General History by Philip Van Ness Myers, we read this under the subheading The Breakup of the Empire, last act in the breakup of the empire in the West, AD 476. Only the shadow of the empire in the West now remained. The provinces of Gaul, Spain, and Africa were in the hands of the Franks, the Goths, the Vandals, and various other intruding tribes. Italy, as well Rome herself, had become again and again the spoil of the barbarians. The story of the 20 years following the sack of the capital by Geiserik, also known as Genseric, there's different spellings and different pronunciations of that name, following the sack of the capital by Geiserik affords only a repetition of the events we have been narrating. During these years, several puppet emperors were set up by army leaders. The last was a child of only 6 years. By what has been called a freak of fortune, this boy sovereign bore the name Romulus Augustus, thus uniting in the name of the last Roman emperor of the West the names of the founder of Rome and the establisher of the empire. He reigned only 1 year when Odoacer, the leader of a small German tribe, dethroned the child emperor. In our Revelation series, we go through the whole decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and in Revelation chapter 8, part 5, we deal with its demise in the West in particular. In case you want all of the details, you can go there. Philip Van Ness Myers goes on, the transaction marks not only the end of the line of Western Roman emperors, but also the virtue extinction of the imperial rule in the western provinces of the empire, the culmination of a century-long process of dissolution. This gradual transfer of leadership from the failing Roman race to the new barbarian folk was one of the most momentous revolutions in European history. Remember, before we read in Revelation 12 and 13 that the crowns moved from the heads to the horns. What is being written here by this historian was prophesied long in advance. Praise the Lord for that. In this online article dealing with medieval Europe, empires, kingdoms and rulers, we read this. By 364 AD, the Roman Empire had been definitively split into two separate states, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. The Western Empire soon collapsed under the weight of barbarians and Europe was plunged into the medieval era. Under barbarian rule, civilization decreased dramatically, with only the church remaining as one of the few institutions for civilization. Now, it is vitally important to note what this article states. While everything was falling apart, the institutions of civilization were being removed, the church or the religious element of society continued unabated. The same article goes on and says, however, this period was crucial to Western history because modern Western nations directly trace their roots to the kingdoms of this time period. In this book called From Roman Provinces to Medieval Kingdoms, edited by Thomas F.X. Noble, we read this. In 300 CE, the Roman Empire stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the North Sea to the Sahara Desert. A mere 300 years later, the Roman imperial structure was gone, replaced by a series of barbarian kingdoms that became the basis of Europe's eventual medieval and modern states. Now, we are talking about the kingdom of iron transitioning to feet of iron mixed with clay, constituted by 10 toes or 10 kingdoms. And this is borne out in the history of the Western Roman Empire. In this book called View of the State of Europe During the Middle Ages, 7th edition by Henry Hallam, we read this right at the beginning. Before the conclusion of the 5th century, the mighty fabric of empire, which valour and policy had founded upon the 7 hills of Rome, was finally overthrown in all the west of Europe by the barbarous nations from the north, whose martial energy and whose numbers were irresistible. A race of men, formerly unknown or despised, had not only dismembered that proud sovereignty, but permanently settled themselves in its fairest provinces, and imposed their yoke upon the ancient possessors. The Vandals were masters of Africa. The Suevi held part of Spain. The Visigoths possessed the remainder, with a large portion of Gaul. The Burgundians occupied the provinces watered by the Rhone and the Saône. I hope I've pronounced those correctly, but I won't lose any sleep over that if I haven't. And lastly, the Ostrogoths almost all Italy. In Daniel 2 verse 41 it says, And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. Contrary to the preterist view concerning the Fourth World Empire of Daniel 2, the Rome of prophecy and of history did indeed continue, but not as a united entity. Rome continued with the brutal strength of iron, as we shall go on and see later, yet as iron and clay don't completely mix together, in the same way the people of the Fourth Kingdom would be a mixture. They would not be united as one people entirely, but rather it would be a conglomerate of kingdoms, essentially 10 kingdoms as designated by the 10 toes. Now let me ask you this question. How is it that this strange combination of iron and clay was pulled and held together in a semblance of order? Well, let's read on to discover the answer to this. Here we have another online article, and I've provided the address for you to reference. It deals with early medieval Europe, and it says this: Western Europe, on the other hand, crumbled into an impoverished, non-urban patchwork of Germanic kingdoms. Nonetheless, Western Europe remained united spiritually under the Pope, who had emerged in the early Christian period as the supreme figure of Western Christianity, and linguistically by Latin, which remained the scholarly tongue of the West. In short, the medieval West was united as Latin Christendom. Now we are starting to see how this unusual mixture of iron and clay was held together. The vital animating principle, the active binding agent, was the papacy, the Roman Catholic Church. Let's keep looking at this. Here we have a quote from a Roman Catholic Cardinal, Henry Edward Manning, and this gentleman had converted from Anglicanism. And I don't think that it takes too much effort to convert from Anglicanism, as it's not that far removed from Catholicism in any case. But I digress. Manning gives an excellent summary of the dramatic change in the Roman Empire from the Caesars to the papacy, and in so doing he gives a wonderful summary of Bible prophecy concerning the rise of the little horn of Daniel 7. We read in his book, The Temporal Power of the Vicar of Jesus Christ, the following: To the least discerning, it must be manifest that God had some purpose of his divine wisdom in the migration of Constantine and of the empire from Rome to Byzantium. What could be more improbable than that an emperor should forsake the imperial city of 1,000 years? And then he goes on and refers to the Daniel 2 prophecy about the stone cut out without hands filling the whole earth. And to Manning, of course, this represents nothing other than the papacy and the Roman Catholic Church. He continues, the Byzantine emperors ceased to be the proprietors of Italy and of Rome. Now, the abandonment of Rome was the liberation of the pontiffs. Whatsoever claims to obedience the emperors may have made, and whatsoever compliance the pontiff may have yielded, the whole previous relation, anomalous and annulled again and again by the vices and outrages of the emperors, was finally dissolved by a higher power. The providence of God permitted a succession of eruptions, Gothic, Lombard, and Hungarian, to desolate Italy and to efface from it every remnant of the empire. The pontiffs found themselves alone, the sole fountains of order, peace, law, and safety. And from the hour of this providential liberation, when by a divine intervention the chains fell off from the hands of the successor of St. Peter, as once before from his own, no sovereign has ever reigned in Rome except the Vicar of Jesus Christ. Manning continues, the floods which swept all other authorities away threw out into bolder relief and more conspicuous prominence the supreme pastoral authority of the Vicars of Jesus Christ. To whom else should the people go? For they alone had not only the words of eternal life, but the sole and supreme moral power to support and reorganize the shattered society of Rome. The possession of the pontiffs commences with the abandonment of Rome by the emperors. Further along, Manning says, and rebellion against the vicar of the incarnate word is the same order as the rejection of his master. God has instituted his kingdom upon earth and fixed the head and center of it in Rome, as of old in Jerusalem. From statements like this, you can see how it was that the popes came to reign supreme in Europe in both temporal and ecclesiastical matters, and the people and the nations dared not resist. To refuse the pope was to refuse God himself, and of course this meant burning forever in a devil's hell. Then over a few more pages in the same book we read, I then showed you how, by an indirect but divine providence, our divine Lord has liberated his vicar on earth in the plenitude of his spiritual sovereignty from all civil subjection, first by the translation to the east, and then by the eventual extinction of the Roman Empire in Italy. This is the very same thing we read of as prophecy in 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 7, where it says, "For the mystery of iniquity doth already work, only he who now letteth will let, until he be taken out of the way." The Fourth World Empire, Rome, was already established, but within it was working an even greater and more terrible apostasy. There was something standing in the way of its transition to the feet of iron and clay. There was something preventing the mystery of iniquity coming to full flower, and that was the seat of the empire occupied by the Roman emperors. But when that was removed, when that was taken out of the way in the West, the papacy was free to step into the power vacuum that had been left behind. And so we read from Henry Manning, who stated that the abandonment of Rome was the liberation of the pontiffs, and also the pontiffs found themselves alone, the sole fountains of order, peace, law, and safety. In Robert Carangola's book 70 Weeks, The Historical Alternative, we read this: "The word letteth, let, can properly be interpreted restrain. What was the hindrance to the emergence of the man of sin? That is, the little horn, or the eighth form of Roman government. In the primary case, the apostle speaks of it in the neuter gender. You know what withholds. Then he uses the masculine gender, he who now hinders. The only logical conclusion is that the hindrance or restrainer will be both neuter and masculine. As long as the Roman Empire was under pagan rule, the man of sin could not take his place of authority in the seven-hilled city. Thus the hindrance in the primary neuter gender is fulfilled in the Roman Empire, and the same hindrance in the masculine gender was fulfilled in the despotic emperors. They had to be taken out of the way first. We have already seen how this happened with the Gothic invasions. In 476 AD, Rome pagan vanished in the west, only to be replaced by apostate Rome papal. It was like one rising from the dead, surviving a mortal head wound. See Revelation 13, verse 3. The following is a brief list of statements confirming this understanding. Chrysostom, Bishop of Constantinople, 390 AD, writes, "By the hindrance, Paul means the Roman Empire. This was also believed by Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, 400 AD. Jerome, 400 AD, declared, if St. Paul had written openly and boldly that the man of sin would not come until the Roman Empire was destroyed, a just cause of persecution would then appear to have been afforded against the Church in her infancy." Bishop Wadsworth wrote in 1850, "The earliest Christian writers declare, with one voice, the he who letteth was the heathen Roman Empire." Refer Apocalypse, page 520. The Amplified Bible, 1958, footnote of 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 6 states, "Many believe this one who restrains the Antichrist to be the Holy Spirit." That would be the futurist interpretation. Then the Amplified Bible goes on, "A majority think it refers to the Roman Empire." Robert Carangola also provides three other historic quotes which are as follows. Tertullian, who said, "We pray for the Roman emperors and empire, for we know that convulsions and calamities are threatening the whole world, and the end of the world itself is kept back by the intervention of the Roman Empire." Then Jerome, who said, "The Roman world rushes to destruction, and we bend not our neck in humiliation. The hindrance in Antichrist's way is removing, and we heed it not. In that one city," being Rome, "the whole world hath fallen." And then also Evagrius, who said, "The Roman emperors are driven from their kingdoms. Wars rage. All is commotion. Antichrist must be at hand." Once again, this is far removed from preterism, which confines the whole thing to the 1st century AD. Yet in the very same prophecy, we read in 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 2, "That ye be not soon shaken in mind, or be troubled, neither by spirit, nor by word, nor by letter, as from us that the day of Christ is at hand." Right at the outset, we are told that what is being said is not at hand, not expected any time soon. It was to be in the future. For the historicists, this is all very elementary teaching. Regretfully, the preterists have been deceived by doctrine which came out of the very same mystery of iniquity, which mystery of iniquity was discovered by the Protestants so long ago, but has since been trodden underfoot by those who now say that they know better than what their forefathers taught them. What a shame. Edward Gibbon says this: about the close of the 6th century, Rome had reached the lowest period of her depression. By the removal of the seat of empire and the successive loss of the provinces, the sources of public and private opulence were exhausted. The lofty tree under whose shade the nations of the earth had reposed was deprived of its leaves and branches, and the sapless trunk was left to wither on the ground. Like Thebes or Babylon or Carthage, the name of Rome might have been erased from the earth if the city had not been animated by a vital principle which again restored her to honour and dominion. And then Edward Gibbon goes on to explain that vital principle which operated to restore Rome to her honour and dominion, and it was the papacy, the institution of the Roman Catholic Church. Edward Gibbon goes on, their temporal power insensibly arose from the calamities of the times, and the Roman bishops, who have deluged Europe and Asia with blood, were compelled to reign as the ministers of charity and peace. The misfortunes of Rome involved the apostolic pastor in the business of peace and war. Here we have a quote from the American Catholic Quarterly Review, 1911, which says this: long ages ago, when Rome, through the neglect of the Western emperors, was left to the mercy of the barbarous hordes, Romans turned to one figure for aid and protection and asked him to rule them, and thus in this simple manner, the best title of all to kingly right, commenced the temporal sovereignty of the popes. And meekly stepping to the throne of Caesar, you have to choke on some of these things, and meekly stepping to the throne of Caesar, the Vicar of Christ took up the scepter to which the emperors and kings of Europe were to bow in reverence through so many ages, from sentiments of respect for the dignity of his office, and because he was the only mediator whom they recognized in their almost interminable wars. Grattan Guinness writes in his book Romanism and the Reformation this: the mighty Caesars had fallen. Augustus, Domitian, Hadrian, Diocletian were gone. Even the Constantines and Julians had passed away. The seat of sovereignty had been removed from Rome to Constantinople. Goths and Vandals had overthrown the Western Empire. The once mighty political structure lay shivered into broken fragments. The imperial government was slain by the Gothic sword. The Caesars were no more, and Rome was an actual desolation. Then slowly on the ruins of old imperial Rome rose another power and another monarchy, a monarchy of much loftier aspirations and more resistless might, claiming dominion, not alone over the bodies, but over the consciences and souls of men. Dominion not only within the limits of the fallen empire, but throughout the entire world. Higher and higher rose the papacy, till in the dark ages all Christendom was subject to its sway. Under the sacerdotal monarchy of St. Peter, says Gibbon, quote, the nations began to resume the practice of seeking on the banks of the Tiber their kings, their laws, and the oracles of their fate, end quote. And this was a voluntary submission. Dr. Dollinger writes in his book The Church and the Churches, or the Papacy and the Temporal Power, 1862, this: out of the chaos of the great northern migrations and the ruins of the Roman Empire, there gradually arose a new order of states, whose central point was the Papal See. Therefrom inevitably resulted a position not only new, but very different from the former. The new Christian empire of the West was created and upheld by the Pope. The Pope became constantly more and more, by the state of affairs, with the will of the princes and of the people, and through the power of public opinion, the chief moderator at the head of the European Commonwealth. In short, the whole of Western Christendom formed in a certain sense a kingdom, at whose head stood the Pope and the Emperor, The former, however, with continually increasing and far preponderating authority. Again, we read from Henry Hallam in his book View of the State of Europe During the Middle Ages, 4th edition, under the heading Papal Authority in the 13th Century. He refers to the noonday of papal dominion and says, Rome inspired all the terror of her ancient name. She was once more the mistress of the world, and kings were her vassals. The Roman Catholic Cardinal Henry Edward Manning wrote in his book The Temporal Power of the Vicar of Jesus Christ this: I say, then, that it was God's own act which liberated his vicar upon earth from subjection to temporal power, and that for 1200 years the bishops of Rome have reigned as temporal princes. They have possessed their own. No man has given to them their sovereign rights. They reign there as Christian princes by the providence of God. They are the first example of a Christian monarchy, the first seed of Christian Europe, the first roll of Christian princes. Note that Cardinal Manning specifically states, for 1200 years the bishops of Rome have reigned as temporal princes. This is a meaningless detail to both the preterists and the futurists, but it is significant to historicists who understand that the predicted time of the Roman papal dominion was 1,260 days, which signifies 1,260 years. And here we have a Roman Catholic cardinal referring to the 1200-year period that the bishops of Rome reigned as temporal princes. Now, I'm going to come back to this day for a year business later, but right at the moment, it is wonderful to see how that even the writers that write in defense of the papacy unwittingly confirm the interpretation of the prophecy. Cardinal Manning goes on in his book and says this: It is true indeed that in the 3 centuries between the conversion of Constantine and the period of St. Gregory the Great, in those 3 centuries of turbulence and disorder, invasion and warfare, by which Italy and Rome was afflicted, the temporal power of the Supreme Pontiff was only in its beginning. But about the 7th century it was firmly established, and that which the divine providence had prepared from the beginning received its full manifestation, and no sooner was the material power which once reigned in Rome consecrated and sanctified by the investiture of the Vicar of Jesus Christ with the temporal sovereignty over the city where he dwelt, than he began to create throughout Europe the order of Christian civilization, Christian empires, Christian monarchies, which, confederated together, have maintained the peace and order of the world from that hour to this. And now for these 1200 years, there's that prophetic time again, the peace, the perpetuity, and the fruitfulness of this Christian civilization of Europe has been owing solely in its principle to this consecration of the power and the authority of the great empire of Rome, taken up of old, perpetuated, preserved, as I have said, by the salt which had been sprinkled from heaven, and continued in the person of the Supreme Pontiff, and in that order of Christian civilization of which he has been the creator. This is nothing other than the historical record confirming the continuation of the legs of iron, the Empire of Rome under the Popes of Rome. Eliot quotes in the Horae Apocalypticae from the pontifical writer Flavio Blondus, who said this: The princes of the world now adore and worship as perpetual dictator the successor not of Caesar but of the fisherman Peter, that is, the Supreme Pontiff, the substitute of the aforementioned emperor. Eliot also quotes from another pontifical writer, one Augustine Stuccius, who said this: The empire having been overthrown, unless God had raised up the pontificate, Rome, resuscitated and restored by none, would have become uninhabitable and been a most foul habitation thenceforward of cattle. But in the pontificate it revived as with a second birth. Its empire in magnitude not indeed equal to the old empire, but its form not very dissimilar, because all nations, from east and from west, venerate the Pope not otherwise than they before obeyed the emperor. And what does the prophecy say? One of the heads was wounded unto death, but its deadly wound was healed. The Roman Empire transitioned from legs of iron to feet of iron mixed with clay. A little horn, a little kingdom came up in the midst of the 10 kingdoms. This little horn had a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows, and the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them. This is exactly what history demonstrates occurred, and we will continue to look at this as we proceed. In Robert Carangola's book, The Present Reign of Jesus Christ, he includes a quote from Jude de Broye, who said this: "The Bishop of Rome mounted the throne whence the emperors fell, and took little by little the position rendered vacant by the desertion of the successor of Augustus." Joseph Tanner, in his book Daniel and the Revelation, provides this quote: "Mr. Leck, author of the History of Rationalism, speaking of the development of the papacy, says, 'It is no other than the ghost of the deceased Roman Empire sitting crowned upon the grave thereof.'" Joseph Tanner also goes on further and says this: "Professor Bryce further tells us of how Boniface III showed himself to the crowding pilgrims at the Jubilee of 1300, seated on the throne of Constantine, arrayed with sword and crown and scepter, shouting aloud, 'I am Caesar, I am Emperor.'" In 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 3 we read, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition." And so history has, of course, followed the word of the Lord. There was a great general apostasy as the masses left true apostolic Christianity and replaced it with a paganized, corrupt form of Christianity, no longer with Christ at the head, but a man, the Pope of Rome, who eventually took to himself the seat formerly occupied by the Caesars. Is there any wonder that when the light began to shine in the people's hearts, that they started to recognize the fulfillment of all of these things in the beast system that they were dwelling in the very midst of, Roman Catholic Europe? And again, I'll take another break here and continue this segment in the next part.